Welcome to the fifth session of 16th module on blockchain and smart grid analytics. In this section, we are going to talk about in brief about the composer. I'm going to take you through the web console of the composer, which is hosted on IBM Bluemix, and I'm going to take you through a few use cases around that. But before going into that, let's try and understand what is a simple application development cycle, for that matter, if you talk about a composer. Now, you can use a composer, Hyperledger composer on a local machine, or you can use it on a web as well. So considering that this is a typical development lifecycle we are supposed to be following, let's have a few steps. 1, install the Fabric Composer tools. 2, you need to define the business network, assets, and the transactions. 3, you need to implement the transaction processors. Once you have implemented the transaction processors, you need to test the business network within the Composer UI. Once the Composer UI gives you the, it has the business network shown there, you can deploy this business network to a live fabric, the Hyperledger fabric, in the form of a BNA file. Once this is all done, you can generate a sample application for this network, and you can go ahead with the testing of the sample application. This provides a strong basis to start your application experience from a Hyperledger and a blockchain point of view. Before I take you to the Hyperledger Composer, let's try and understand few concepts around Composer. So primarily there are three things in a Composer. 1, there are few participants, as we talked about in one of the modules in blockchain, that you need to have in a business network, there needs to be some participants around. These participants needs to have some assets being shared between them, transfer of assets in some way. You need to have these registered someplace, and these are all transactions, right? So all of this needs to be a part of a BNA file, which is a business network archive file. In a blockchain, a Hyperledger Composer, once we define the model, the next thing that we need to define is the business logic in form of a JavaScript file. There is another component, which is the third one as a part of the composer, which is the access control list, which defines the rules for sharing and privacy for the different business network participants in a composer. So a typical Fabric Composer network will have 1, a model definition file, 2, a set of JavaScript processors, 3, an access control list, and we bundle all this together in a BNA. Let me go back now to the web UI of Composer to explain how does it works. So I am right now at this link, which is composer-playground.mybluemix.net, and I want to actually understand the various business networks here. Now, to begin with, let's say I want to deploy a new business network. So let me click on deploy a new business network. If you scroll down, you'll be able to see few sample networks around here, right? For example, there is a network for animal tracking on this. There is another network for, the bond networks, right? There is another network which is defined for car auction there. There is a network for digital property, the buying and selling of digital properties. There is a network on letter of credit creation and generation and all that. There is another network for fund clearing. There is a network on perishable goods, right? How do you actually store them? How do you trace them through a supply chain? There is a network which basically is around trade, right? As you can see, there are so many networks which are samples which are made available in terms of for you to get started. Let's quickly try and do the basic sample network, right, in order to keep the things easy for us. So I simply click on the basic sample network. I can define my own network name here, and once I'm done with this, I can quickly go and say I want to deploy this. Once I'm deploying this, I'll see on my business network, I will see this sample network being created here. Let's try and connect to this sample using connect now. Okay. Now, once I'm able to connect, you can see the UI here. It gives me a complete view of the various components in this business network. Now, as we discussed earlier, you can see this. There is a sample.cto file, which basically defines the various models, the various participants in this business network, right? You see this, there's a participant, there is a sample participant identified by some participant ID, and so that can be easily defined. There is another file called JavaScript file, as we talked about, which has the details about the business logic embedded into it. So whatever we want to perform as an action item or the logic, we need to define in this JavaScript file. As you see in this particular example, we have a sample transaction tx, which talks about, value having a constant old value, and then we define it as some way. We basically align it with something, some value there. There is another file, which is the ACL file we talked about, the access control list, in which we define which participant in the business network can do what he can see, what he cannot see. All that basically defined over here. So whether we are giving him a read access, or we are giving him a write access, or we giving him completely allow. So we can have it all. If you see on the top, there is another tab called test, right? So in order to do it, I can create a sample participant. So let me click on create a new sample, click create a new participant. Now, if you see here, it already has a code populated for it, right? What you can do is you can simply use this participant ID, or you can use some other participant, whatever you feel like. Let me say I want to create new. So the moment I say that, it has created a new participant with an ID 0533, right? And I can create maybe one more participant, right? If you see, it's randomly picking up the participant ID 1789 in this case. So I go ahead and I create two participants in this network. Okay. Let me go to the sample asset now. So far, we have got two business network participants. But then in order to do some business, there needs to be some asset on the network, right? Which they can maybe buy or sell, or something like that, right? So let me create a new asset here. Okay. So I'm picking up this, and I'm going by default, I say, no, let's create this asset. And let me create one more asset to populate the network here. I'm going to create again another asset here, right? So right now, if you see here, whatever we have done so far, it is all logged on the blockchain with the timestamp and the activity that we did. For example, we basically started a new network, right? We added a new participant there. If you see, there is a entry there. We can view the record for this entry, right? So whatever we just did, it is visible along with the timestamp, transaction ID. What action did we do? It is all recorded there, right? So whatever you perform on a blockchain network, it's basically getting recorded on the network there, along with the entire details. So whatever action we have performed so far, including adding a participant or adding an asset, it is all getting recorded there. So this is actually a very easy way of getting started with Hyperledger Composer, right? Let me try and deploy another business network with some more details in that, right? So let's say I want to start and deploy maybe a digital property network, right? Let's do this. And so it is telling me, this particular has participant, how many assets, what's the transaction type, it's all mentioned here. Let me go ahead and deploy this business network. Now, once I have it, let me connect to the network using this card here. Again, I'll go back to the same UI, which defines all the three files, the CTO file, the JavaScript file, and the ACL file, right? So if you go ahead and if you see in this file, this time you will have an asset defined as land title, and which will be identified by title ID, right? And there would be a person which would be the owner of this title ID, which is associated with this particular asset, right? Similarly, there is another asset called sales agreement, which is again identified by its ID. And there would be, a couple of actors in this sales agreement. There would be a buyer, there would be a seller, there would be a title for the land, and of course, there needs to be a sales ID which will be unique and which will be, identifying this particular sales deal. If you go down further, there is a participant, which is a person which will be like buying or selling the property, right? So again, it is identified by a person ID. And again, it may have a first name and a last name there, right? And so if you want to have a particular property for sale, you need to have a particular, another asset called register property for sale, whether it's, in the name of a person who is actually owning the property and the land title. Now let's move back to the other script file, right, in which we said we'll define the business logic there, right? Now if you see here, there is a function for, on registry property for sale, right? We basically define if it is for true, means if it is up for sale, this is set as true, and then this will reflect for buying and selling, right? Similarly, if you go and you see the access control list here, now it should be populated with some more people, with some more participants, right? So see here, the default rule says that allow all participants access to all resources, right? So any participant can actually, view all of it, right? Similarly, for a network admin user, we have again defined certain criteria, what he can do and what he cannot do, right? So this is how we basically constrain that on a business network, which participant can, do what role, what can he see, what he cannot see, what action can he perform, what action he can't perform. Uh, I will actually request to, you to explore something called as code patterns, which are really a cool way of learning a particular technology. Now here there is a code pattern which is around decentralized energy using Hyperledger, right? So let me give you the view here. So this code pattern basically talks about creating a decentralized energy network using Hyperledger Composer. Now if you scroll down, it gives you the entire description of the use case. What is this particular problem going to do? In what way are you going to solve the problem? It'll give you a complete instruction around, how do you need to proceed with step-by-step approach. Step 1, clone the repo. Step 2, you can set up the Hyperledger Fabric. Step 3, you generate the BNA file. Step 4, you deploy to Fabric. Step 5, run the application. Step 6, create participants. Step 7, perform transactions. Now, if you map it back to the video where I just gave you the demo which I just gave you, we are doing the same thing. We basically cloned the business network there. Once it was done, it was all happening at the back and it was all abstracted from the user. Once we were able to generate the BNA, we were able to deploy it, because underlying the Composer, it's the Fabric which is running. So whatever we deployed actually using Composer, it was getting deployed on a Fabric only. Once we ran the application there, you saw me creating a few participants there, participant 1, participant 2, creating a few assets there. And once I was able to create some participants and some assets, I was able to do some transactions. This is the flow of various components which are there. Let me quickly try to zoom it for you so that it is a bit more clear here. Now, if you can see here, there is an admin which is having Angular UI, right? So it's a UI which is connected to a Composer using a REST server, right? And you have a Hyperledger Fabric underneath, which is running all of these transactions for us. So an administrator interacts with the UI, which comprises an Angular framework. And this all processes, all these requests which are going from the application are sent on a network through a REST API. All these actually are landing on Hyperledger Fabric v1 here. And the REST API is used to retrieve the state of the database, right? And once it has that, the Angular framework gets the data using a get call for the REST API. Now, from an understanding point of view, it is very important to have access to the code for this application, right? So if you see there are buttons for getting the code and all. So once you click on this button will actually land you to a GitHub repository. It's a public GitHub repository, which gives you access to the entire code. Now, if you see here, you have the entire code made available here. The model, all the files are available here. You have an option of cloning this GitHub repo, or you can download the code, and then you can work on this code again. Let me go down further in this link. Again, I have a complete detail about the architecture flow, how these components are talking to each other. In this particular solution, we are using Hyperledger Composer, Angular Framework, and Loopback. Now, if you see now, it's giving you a complete prerequisite how to run this particular solution, right? You need to have an Ubuntu Linux 14.04 or 16.04, both 64-bit, or it can also run on a Mac OS 10.12. You need to have a Docker version 17 onwards to run this particular sample. You need to have an NPM 5 onwards, version 5.x onwards to run this particular code. Again, you have a prerequisite of Node version 8.9 or higher version in order to run this particular code. And of course, you need to have Hyperledger Composer installed, right? If you see this, it particularly gives you the entire commands, everything in order to run an application. Let me run you through the few steps here. Now, in order to clone the repo where this code is available, you need to use a git clone, and then you give the URL where this of the git repo, and it will automatically clone the repo for you. Now, the entire code is made available, for a participant so that he can practice and he can do it on his own, right? So see the command docker kill, it will basically kill all the previous instances that are running on the machine. And then you can actually pull down the fabric. it says download fabric, that there is a script available for that, and it will run the fabric, it will install the fabric on your own local machine. Once that is done, you can actually generate the BNA file from the root directory now and deploy it to the fabric. So if you go down, you remember me connecting to the network using a connect there. So that was a business card that was getting generated there, and I was actually connecting using that. So the entire thing is basically made available. The entire code is made available here. Now, once you have the application uploaded, you can run the code. Once you run the code, you should be able to see the entire participants, right? So in this particular code, there are a couple of participants like residents, like bank, like utility companies, and then you need to execute a few transactions. Now, how can you execute transactions? There need to be a couple of players in the transactions. So there is a transaction which is defined between the resident to resident. So remember the discussion when we were talking about peer-to-peer buying and selling of electricity. So this is what it is, right? So you have resident one producing some electricity using some renewable resources, either a solar or a wind or something, and you have another resident who is looking to buy that electricity, and both are basically available on a blockchain network. So this particular transaction connects the two for them to enable buy and sell between each other, right? So P2P approach of buying and selling of electricity. The second transaction is about, when a resident is trying to make a payment to a bank in terms of a electricity coin or in terms of a fiat currency. So the second transaction is around that. And then there is another transaction defined between a resident to a utility, right? So here we have a REST server to communicate within the network. It's basically hosted here. So what I wanted to say is there is a complete flow of running and executing this particular application. It's very easy to do. You'll find the fabric docs available here. There is a link for the composer docs, which is also available here. There is also a YouTube link available here for seeing the demo here, which you can make use of. And I can assure this is the most easiest way to learn a particular new technology like blockchain, and it'll really open up a new avenue for learning and exploring how blockchain can be utilized in a smart grid systems. Thank you for your time. Thank you.